time to put down your rods and pick up your headphones. Join JC and Andy from Ebb Tide Tackle for The Outflow, the podcast talking all things lure fishing with hardcore fishers from all over the world.
Welcome back to The Outflow. I'm John Carhill, and today I'm running solo. We have been doing some serious miles on the show with our guests, and today is no different as we head to sunny South Florida in the USA. We are speaking with a special guest about a very special saltwater technique. More and more people are getting into this, SPJ, or slow pitch jigging. I must admit, I'm a bit of a noob when it comes to this. Our guest is well known and is a guru of the technique. Welcome, Mr. Benny Ortiz.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here from sunny South Florida, all the way across the world, to talk to you guys about slow pitch jigging. So I guess to start off, usually I've done a lot of seminars with this type of technique and was one of the few early adopters here in the United States with regard to the technique itself. Okay, so the way that I like to structure it usually in terms of how we're going to progress here is going to be number one, I'll talk to you about the actual tackle itself, what this is, how this evolved into what it is, all right? We'll go through the rod, the reel, the line, your terminal connections, everything the best that I can do verbally to describe exactly what's going on for the listeners at home, all right?
Perfect, man. Thank you so much for giving up your time. That sounds like a great structure. We're just going to sit back and listen.
All right, so first, let me start off with where we started here in the U.S. Personally, I started slow pitch jigging about 7 years ago. Originally, the technique itself, it started in Japan. A man named Norihito Sato was the one who was the first person to pioneer the technique and actually develop the technique probably 15, 20 years ago in Japan. The technique is really for high-pressure fisheries. Okay, so here in the United States in South Florida, it certainly is a high-pressure fishery. In Japan, where it originated, high-pressure fishery. And what it is to use a metal lure that has different falling properties, which mimics a wounded baitfish. Okay, so where if you're used to the speed jigging technique, where you're ripping that jig through the water column, and it's the fleeing baitfish, as people will say, slow pitch jigging is more the wounded baitfish. So it really creates an easy meal for the fish. Everything that they've eaten their entire life that looks like it's wounded has been a fish until this time now, where it actually is a metal lure with your hooks on it. So it's been a very productive technique. It's taken many years to figure out what works and what doesn't work for our particular fishery, which I would imagine that in Australia, you guys would also have to do that for you as well. Most of the fish that you're targeting with it are your demersal fish, your bottom fish, but there's a lot of pelagics that are all over these jigs as well. Wahoo, for you guys, you have your kingfish, Samson fish, things like that. Bonitas that are up in the water column, tunas. But then you also have groupers, snappers, what you guys call cod, I believe, sometimes. But it's all those bottom fish that we're looking to target. And trying to figure out how to get them to bite these lures. So about 7 years ago, what we found out was that there was this technique, and no one had really heard of it. At the time, it was called micro jigging or slow jigging, and they were using these little tiny lures and little tiny rods, little tiny reels and light line, and they were catching fish. Okay, and we didn't know really necessarily why they were catching the fish, but we saw that they were catching fish. So how do we adapt what they're doing in Japan to what we were doing here or what you guys would be doing on your side of the world? So the first thing we looked at was, okay, well, what is the Japanese fishery? They're fishing, generally speaking, deeper water. You're in the Pacific. They're an island where it just drops off, so it gets very deep very quickly. They're not fishing for the biggest fish primarily. A lot of the more prized fish are the smaller fish there that happen to live in deep water. So everything is specialized for that particular fishery. How do we get down to the bottom? How do we stay vertical? And we'll touch on that as we go along. But a lot of the stuff that they were using over there, when we started using it here, we were quite honestly getting our butts handed to us by some of the bigger bottom fish, the bigger groupers and snappers. that live here primarily on structure. Okay, so we have reefs, wrecks, things like that are going to hold these fish, and you need to be able to put the brakes on them somehow. So that's how it started to evolve, where we started, a very expensive game of trial and error, essentially, which was start off first with that little tiny rod and reel, light line, light jigs, and realize, okay, we need to start using some heavier stuff, but balance it out. That's really the key. Balance out this system so that everything works in synergy with each other, where you have, the right amount of strength, that you know where those boundaries are, where you can push, where you can't push, and really use the tackle to your advantage. So that's really where we started. Over the years, we've done a lot of testing, and I think testing is very important in terms of, like breaking strength of line, how much load can the rods actually take, putting heat on them. If anybody's watched any videos from Japan where people are slow pitch jigging, you'll notice a very interesting fighting technique where people will point the rod almost straight down at the water and not do a lift and pump like you're taught your entire life. It's essentially using the reel as a winch to pull the fish up from the bottom and just very calmly bring it up rather than literally fight the fish all the way up. You'll notice that the actual jigging action itself is very melodic. It's kind of nice to watch when people are doing it properly. It's very smooth and rhythmic. But then there are moments of just absolute violence when a fish strikes the lure, and that's what keeps you coming back.
Yeah, for sure it does, man. You raise a heap of things that I've seen there. That the slow pitch jigging style is very, very pleasurable to watch. It's the complete opposite of a mechanical jigging situation, and to my mind, that's obviously related to the fall of the jig, and right. The fluttering of the jig as opposed to a jig that drops like a stone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So, and that's actually a really great segue to the tackle itself, and let's start with the rod. Okay, so the folks at home, they're going to be on audio, but for here while we're on our Skype call, I can maybe show you a little bit because I have some toys here. But this is a basic slow pitch rod. So let me just give you kind of the general characteristics of a slow pitch rod as we kind of work through this. Usually, most of the rods are between 6'3" and about 6'8", 6'10". Okay. I operate in freedom units. I'm sorry. I'll work as best I can to do metric stuff. So
no, we're good. We're very versatile down under. We understand both.
All right, great. Well, when we get to the jigs, we'll start doing the metric. But in terms of the length of the rod, usually between 6'3", 6'10". That's your pure slow pitch rod. Okay. The other type of rod that is out there is called a long fall rod. All right. Now, a long fall rod, as the name implies, is just simply a lift and fall, which is a much simpler technique, but equally effective in my opinion. Those are a little bit beefier. The rods are about 8 feet long, give or take, but you can see, and you can't see at home, but on the screen here, you can see kind of the difference in the butt end where it's a lot beefier. You can put a lot more heat on those rods. And it's better for larger boats that we've kind of figured that out along the way. We'll touch on that in a little bit, but let's just talk about pure slow pitch rods. Okay. So the first thing that you're going to notice if you're looking at a slow pitch rod is that it's extremely thin. Okay. It's a very, very thin blank, and there's a lot of exposed blank. There's not a big EVA section on the tail. In fact, the butt end of the rod is almost completely exposed. It's got a little knob of an end cap on it. And these are all functional things. Everything, if the Japanese do one thing very well, it's overthink stuff. And they do it to a degree where it's just this perfection where they've cut out every possible thing that is unnecessary. So that's really what they've done with slow pitch rods. So starting at the bottom, you've got your very long exposed blank on the butt. And everything about this, the best way I've heard it described is that slow pitch is really a listening game. You're not actually physically listening with your ears, but it's all about the feedback that you're taking in from the water. So The jig hits the bottom, knowing where your jig is in the water, knowing, relative to where you're marking fish on your sounder, all of that stuff is really at the heart of slow pitch jigging. So as you move up from that exposed blank, which When you're actually pitching the rod will be under your forearm. You come up to the reel seat. The reel seat you're going to see is that there's no, in the front here, there's no real foregrip on these things, okay? And that goes back to the idea of it's not a lift and pump fight. You're not going to put this in your belt. You're not going to put it in a gimbal and lift and pump on this thing. If you start doing that on a traditional slow pitch rod, for the vast majority of them, you're going to have a two-piece rod really quickly.
For sure.
So you'll also notice that there's a conventional reel seat on this one. Almost any dedicated slow pitch jigger is going to fish a conventional reel. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but that's a very important component of the rod itself. As you go up the rod, you'll see, there's one thing that a lot of people start to get really worried about is that the guides are so small. Okay, the guides are small for a reason. The guides are small because you want to keep that line close to your blank. Again, a listening game. You want to get that feedback. Braid has no stretch. Braid is very responsive. You can feel a fish sniffing your jig on this stuff because it's so technical. You'll also notice that some of these rods, a lot of them, are spiral wrapped, which means that the guides start out regular conventional and then usually spiral to either the left or the right, depending on the handedness of the angler, eventually ending up on the bottom of the rod. Okay.
Yeah.
That'll happen for a couple of reasons. There's three real primary reasons. The first is when you actually are loaded up on the fish, it keeps the line off the blank itself. All right. The second reason is when you're on a big fish, and let's say for me, I'm a right-handed angler, right? So I have a right-handed conventional reel. If I'm cranking down on that right-hand side, by having the guide spiral to the left, that naturally will even out the rod in terms of keeping it straight. And when you're not using your rod to lift and pump, it's very important that everything's keeping in a straight line. Your line, isn't interfered with anything. The last reason why you have that is actually because when you're jigging, a lot of times you're going to have slack line. That slack line is going to hit the top of your rod. When it hits the top of your rod and your spiral guides are on the bottom, it's going to slide off very easily, and you're going to have much less foul-ups. Okay, so everything about it is functional. But you better make sure that your line-to-line connections are really tight and small. For instance, an FG knot, a PR knot, those are the types of connections that we need to use in this type of fishing, which kind of segues us over into the reels. But before we get there, do you have any particular questions about the rod themselves or
Before we started recording, Benny, we had a brief chat about fighting techniques, and I think while we're talking about the rods, it could be a chance to explore that a little bit. I've seen some people probably fighting what might have been smaller fish, fighting relatively normally. They're very parabolic rods. The rod's up under the arm. The fight is like a small pump and wind, but quite a small one because of the bend of the rod. Essentially, you can't go ripping that thing up.
Right.
But I've also seen, what you said about them being used as a winch, where the rod's pointed basically at the fish. The angler thumbs down, lifts, winds back down. It's a really kind of a bit of a brutal looking technique, but it's effective, yeah.
Yeah, it's super effective, and the reason why people do that, particularly the latter part of what you said, that pointing the rod down and actually pulling the rod in a straight line to you as opposed to pulling up vertically like to a 45-degree angle, that keeps the pressure off the blank. Okay, so that means that you're just literally using that reel as a winch as it's coming up. Okay, so you really are utilizing the drag of your reel. You're utilizing your line strength, your line connections, and slowly bringing that fish up without, putting that heat on the fish with that lift and pump method. Kind of going back to the rods, though, and one thing I didn't mention was really one of the hallmark characteristics of these rods is actually the recoil of them. Okay, the really slow, even recoil of these rods is what imparts the action on a jig. These rods are really a one-trick pony for the most part. These things are designed to just work a jig in the water. The better the rod, the better it is able to work a jig in deeper water. Okay, so For people who are looking to fish in much shallower water, that action isn't not necessarily as important as if you're fishing in deeper water where you really need to work a heavy jig appropriately. Okay, so you're looking for that very slow, even recoil with your jig. If you look for, in a lot of companies right now, especially because this is becoming the hot technique, they're using a lot faster action rods. They're rebranding, your essentially a snapper rod, a bait rod, repurpose the grips, reconfigure the guides, and all of a sudden you have magically a slow pitch jigging rod. But if you feel the tip on them, they're fast. They're really fast, and that fast action is not what you want, because what happens is that recoil will actually flip your jig in the water. You'll wind up losing control of the jig, not knowing where it is. Your tail hooks get fouled up on your leader, and everybody has a bad time. Okay, by having that slow, even, deliberate recoil of the rod, very high carbon content rod, very elastic rod, it really just makes for a better experience and a better presentation of the jig itself.
You've done a great job there of explaining to me, man, how the fast action versus slow action is important in this technique. All about the jig getting the right action.
Exactly.
I see a lot about these rod design where it's actually about, probably not so much being a fighting machine, but it's delivering the action to the lure to get the bite. That's, the front end of the design.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the entire purpose of these rods. Now, as we're moving forward with technology, that's how these things originally started. As we're moving forward with technology, what we're finding is that we're making some technological advances that is now allowing us to put more heat on these rods.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a couple of new design concepts in terms of construction. There's some companies that are using solid blanks versus hollow blanks. There's particularly with one of the companies that I work with, we're working on actually a new concept, which is an oval design as opposed to a round design, where you can shave off weight and maintain the same strength of the rod, decrease it by 20 to 30%, which is pretty cool. So everything now is shifting. The technology is shifting as it becomes more popular. You can go on YouTube and you can see, one company in particular, the Pump Like a Man, if you've ever seen that with, they shall remain.
I haven't seen it, no.
Oh, it's so these guys are putting just ridiculous amounts of heat on these rods. These things are bent over into a U shape, but you've got to achieve that balance, and that's the one thing that when I first started talking about this was having that balance between the action of the rod and the strength of the rod. And usually, once you go too far to either side, you'll sacrifice the other. All right, if you go too much to the action side, you'll sacrifice the strength. Too much to the strength, you sacrifice the action.
I think you pretty accurately described, man, why there is a specialist SPJ rod, like why they exist. Tying an SPJ jig onto your conventional jigger, you've missed the point.
Yeah, I think you have. The one problem that I find a lot with people, especially beginners, is this is not an inexpensive hobby. Right, so
fishing generally, man.
Yeah, I mean, I get a lot of questions from people, particularly when I do seminars here in the States, is will this work with X rod, or will can I do it with this tackle? I mean, yeah, you can, play guitar with a violin, but it's not a guitar. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
100%.
Yeah, so it really comes down to having the right tackle for the job. It's going to make it a lot easier on the angler if you do it that way.
Got a question for you, man. Why is it everything overhead? Well, for the most part.
Really good question. So everything is overhead, and I have a couple of reels here. So between me and you, we can kind of see. There's a couple of reasons. All right. So the first reason is the primary idea with slow pitch before anything else is you want to have your jig vertical in the water. Okay. You want to be vertical in the water. Now, if anyone who's fished a spinning rod or spinning reel, as you open the bail and that jig falls down through the water, there's no way that you can control the fall. It just falls how it falls, and if you have a flutter jig, well, it's going to flutter wildly all the way down. Now, particularly for us here in the States, we fish from a lot of either anchored boats or drifting boats, right? And we have some current here, especially here in Florida, where we've got the Gulf Stream that goes right by us. So we've got, anywhere between, half a knot to a knot current on a great day for us, because the less current the better, to bad days when we got 4 knots of current and it's impossible. So if you let this jig go with the spinning reel and you open the bail and you got 3 knots of current, by the time your boat arrives at the spot, your jig is so far away from you and you're scoped out, not vertical, that it's a real problem. So by having a conventional reel, and this is going back to the Japanese idea of overthinking things, right? If I have this reel, and as that jig is going down in the water, if I put a little bit of pressure on the spool with either my thumb or my index finger as it's going down, that what will happen is the jig, instead of, fluttering wildly through the water like this, it'll stay in a vertical position. Okay?
Right.
So by keeping that tension, it stays vertical. By being vertical, it shoots to the bottom much, much faster. Okay? So that's number one. All right? Number two is that this is all about control, right? So it's all about the feedback that you're receiving, knowing where your jig is in the water. So when I have this reel, and I know that this reel in particular picks up about 42 inches per crank, or probably 1.5 meters for you guys, what's going to happen is you're going to know that with one crank of this reel, I'm about 3 feet off the bottom, or 1 meter off the bottom. Okay, so I can know exactly where my reel is by counting my handle turns as it's going through the water. With a spinning rod, number one, it's hard as heck to figure out when that jig hits the bottom, because you don't get that immediate feedback with the line stop on it. But also, you're much better able to control that jig position in the water and know where you are. The last reason is because of just the mechanics of how a spinning reel works, right? So spinning reels work by, obviously, the spool is spinning, and the lift and the wind down is the primary way that you're going to gain line on those. Very rarely are you going to be in a situation where you're pointing that spinning rod and actually gaining line by being in a direct. Can you use a spinning reel in certain areas, particularly very shallow water with light jigs? Yeah, you can. Is it the best? Probably not. In deeper water, certainly not. Okay, deeper water, you 100% need a conventional reel in order to do this.
I relate to this, man. Like with mechanical jigging, I've jigged to 200 meters in current, 700 gram jigs, and with a spin reel, you have got no idea if you have hit bottom, especially if there's a bit of current. Give you an overhead, you get that slight. You got to be paying attention, but that slight feedback of, I've got bottom.
Exactly, and then that's that constant contact and knowing where you are is really what helps. Having a narrow spool conventional reel really helps as well with your even line lay, so that way you don't have to worry necessarily as you're reeling up where your line is going to go on your reel. But that's generally what you're looking for. I mean, in terms of characteristics overall for a conventional reel, there's several things that I look for. Number one, I look for the retrieve rate. Okay, I look for a retrieve rate for me, and sorry I got to do this, but it's in freedom units. It's 38 inches to like 46 inches per crank, give or take. All right. The reason why that's important, it's not like it's this magic number that I'm pulling out of nowhere. The really reason is once that jig hits the bottom, I want to be able to get that slack out of the line quick, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't necessarily matter what the gear ratio is, right? Because you're just really caring about the retrieve ratio. I don't care if it's a 4-to-4, a 4-to-1, or a 6-to-1 reel, but if I have that certain retrieve rate, right, that's what I'm looking for, all right? Generally speaking, I use a single speed reel. 2-speed reels can be beneficial to you. There's a couple of negatives with the 2-speed reel. There is the idea of there's more parts to break, with either with a 2-speed reel or if you have a level winder on the reel. A lot of people ask about level winders. Look, a lot of people love them. There's a couple of companies that make really good ones, and they're, obviously you're not going to buy a reel that you think is going to break. But the fact of the matter is, when everything rides on the performance of that reel, the less things that can go wrong, the better. So I usually go without a level wind. I use just a regular conventional reel. Personally, I use accurate reels, the 500N Valiant, the 600NN Valiant, and the 300 Valiant. And I like to treat them. And you're also looking for, in general, a smooth, even drag. Something that's going to put out, 10 kilograms of drag, 7 kilograms of drag on the low end, 15 kilograms of drag on the high end. You really don't need much more than that. I mean, most people have no concept as how heavy and strong 15 kilograms of drag really is. You know,
in the top water world, you
yeah.
know, 14, 16 kilograms of drag fighting GTs is like considered the benchmark for heavy GT popping. But I defy a lot of guys to actually fish it.
Exactly.
It's really heavy. It's really heavy.
Really heavy. And, you know, when you see, you know, as I've kind of been involved with some rod design and things like that, and seeing these things on testing, how much stress is put when you are in that above 10 kilograms of drag range, it's really tremendous. And these rods aren't designed for that, so that's why you're using the reel, and you got to make sure that reel has a really smooth, even drag system.
Drag's particularly important when you're fishing lighter lines, and I see you guys fishing relatively light PE when you consider the depth of the water and the fish that you're targeting. Like if it was a different bunch of guys deep dropping with bait with electric reels on those fish, you know, they'd be using 80, 100, 120 pound PE. You guys are using like PE2.
Yeah, PE2, PE3 max usually. And this goes back to what I was saying about the testing, right? So when people talk about, there's three different ways. Let's start with that. Okay, there's three different ways that people measure line, right? There's the PE method, which is really the line diameter, which is kind of the originated in Asia way to do it. All right. There's the pound test method, which is what you just mentioned. So 80 pound test, 120 pound test. That really doesn't tell you anything other than in terms of one manufacturer, their 80 pound line should be thinner than their 120 pound line, right? But it doesn't tell you what, you know, Power Pro 80 pound as opposed to Suffix 832 80 pound. Well, what's those diameter lines? Okay, I have no idea, right?
Yeah.
And the reason why I'm talking about the diameter of line is because going back to the idea of staying vertical in that water column, you want to have the lightest, thinnest possible line with the highest braking strength you can have in order to have the least resistance in the water and stay as vertical as you can when you're in current. Okay? So the last method that people use is the actual braking strength of the line. Not the pound test, but like the IGFA method, which is 12 pound breaks at 12 pound breaks at 12 pound. It doesn't matter where you are, 12 pound line is 12 pound line. Okay? So for us, what we did, we started testing a lot of lines. All right, a lot of lines. And in the States, they don't use PE method. The PE method, I think, is great because you know, all right, my reel holds 400 meters of PE3 line. Great. And that should be across the board. I know how much line is going to be on that spool at all times.
Regardless of the brand.
Right, regardless of the brand, right?
Yeah.
But when you're using, let's say, Yozuri Super Braid versus, you know, Daiwa J Braid, well, what is the 30-pound line in one versus the 30-pound line in the other? How much I'm going to get on my spool? So we tested them, right? So we tested a lot of lines. And we find that in a straight pull, which is really what we're doing, you know, like you said before, we're in a straight line, winching that fish up. 30-pound braid is breaking north of 45, 50 pounds on a straight pull. The reel only puts out 30 pounds of drag on its best day. You can't break it in a straight line. All right, so the next question that people always ask is, well, what happens if you're fishing around structure? You're fishing that light line. Well, how does braid break? Braid breaks because it gets abraded. It gets nicked by something. It touches something that's sharp, and it snaps really quickly, right?
Yeah.
And I hate to break it to you, but if your braid touches the wreck, the reef, or anything else, you already lost the fight, right?
Yeah.
You lost the fight. So, you don't really need, in my opinion, to have that super heavy line. It just creates more influence and resistance in the water as it goes down. You're not as vertical in the water. And hell, I showed you those guides before. It ain't going to pass through those guides, right? When you tie a knot with that, it's not going to pass through those micro guides. So what we found is usually PE3 gives us the best strength to thinness diameter and the best possible result. So that equates to usually 30-pound line.
And that thinness has got such a correlation between the amount of belly you get in the line as you drop, doesn't it?
100%. Yeah. I mean, I've had times where I've been deep dropping in, 200-300 meters of water here off of Florida, fish next to a guy who has the equivalent of P5 line, where I'll be dropping P2, and you notice just he's scoped way out, and I'm almost straight up and down. So that thinner line really does, especially the deeper you go. It's that that linear extrapolation of everything, where the deeper you go, the more line you have in the water, the more influence it's going to have.
Yeah, it's probably the deeper you go, the more critical it is that you're light or thin, rather.
Yeah, and really the less important, generally speaking, it is for the strength of the line too, overall. And really, when you're fishing in that super deep stuff, there's nowhere for those fish to go. There just isn't. So you're not necessarily as worried about putting the brakes on something as you are keeping vertical.
Yeah, gotcha. Can we move on to the jigs themselves? What makes a SPJ jig?
All right, so different jigs have different hydrodynamic properties, which is just a fancy way of saying that they fall different in the water. Okay, so you'll have jigs that are, like this one that I'm showing you here, that is very long and thin. This is a Seafloor Control Messiah. This is a 450 gram jig. It's about a third of a meter long. Quite a big jig. Then you've got little tiny jigs like this one here, which is a 30 gram jig. And they're both considered slow pitch jigs. So really what you're looking to do is, and this is the approach that I have with it, is you're looking to keep vertical, number one, and then kind of key into the movement that the fish is looking for. So some jigs have backsliding action, some jigs wobble, some jigs tumble, some jigs flutter on the way down, and some have really good what we call hang time, where they kind of, as you pitch it up in the water, you lose that touch of the jig, and you feel, and then there it is, and you notice that jig, as it falls to the water, has some good hang time. It's hovering in that water right there. What makes a good slow pitch jig, or what makes something a slow pitch jig, is there's really no rhyme or reason to it. It's just that you're trying to match it to the conditions of the day. That's what you're doing. So I'll have a series of jigs in my bag that are kind of my go-tos. They'll be like the first jig that I drop. I know how that jig will perform in any conditions that are out there. And based on how that one falls in those particular conditions, I'll adjust from there. I'll say, all right, well, this one was a little too fluttery. I'm scoped out a little bit. I need to stay a little bit more vertical. Maybe go to something longer and thinner, right? Or I have no current today. I can go with something that's a little more fluttery, something that's shorter and fatter. Those are kind of the general ideas with it. And the combinations are endless. You've got jigs that are just, reflective. You've got some that are black. You've got some that are glow. You've got some that reflect UV light. You've got some that, like this company NLO here in the United States, that it'll actually, it's a picture of a fish. Here's a, just to show you, it's actually, it looks like a little bait fish.
Yeah, like a yakka, isn't it? What we'd call a yakka or a jack mackerel.
Yeah. So actually, it's similar, same family of the fish here, but there's all different varieties. And they're all going to perform differently. And people always ask me, I'll get similar questions from folks, and they'll say, "What jig would you use for this particular species, right? Or what color jig is the best?" So First things first, I've caught every kind of fish on every type of jig. Doesn't matter. You want to fish for the conditions, not necessarily for the fish that you're targeting. All right. In terms of colors that are best, some people will swear that a green and silver jig should be used at dawn and for whatever reason. And for me, a green one doesn't particularly work that good. I think that it's more important to have the action than the color. And that's just been my experience. The only thing that I will say, and this is particularly at very deep water, is that your jig selection should include something that either glows or reflects UV light. So what I mean by, obviously you know what glow is, but I've got, a black light here, and you can see, for instance, this is a jig. If I put that light on it over here, you can see kind of how it lights up almost. It glows.
Yeah. Yeah, that sheen. Yeah, it does. Yeah.
But it'll reflect that UV light. I think it kind of goes. One thing the anglers have to think about, and this whole slow pitch thing is really a thinking game, is the visible light spectrum changes dramatically as you go down in the water column, right? So the first color you're gonna lose is red. The last one that you're gonna lose is probably gonna be white. And further you go down. But what goes further than the visible light spectrum? Ultraviolet light. Mm-hmm. So these fish that are at the bottom, that are living in pitch black with these big eyes, there's got to be something that they see besides the visible light spectrum in terms of what they're eating. Sure, they're using their lateral line. Sure, they're looking for movement or anything that kind of falls down. But I can't imagine that they're not seeing in maybe some other wavelength that we can't see that picks up to them. Like if you notice, a lot of the fish at depth tend to be pink, right? I don't know why, but for whatever reason, this particular color like this will work better at depth, and sometimes maybe they reflect UV light better. I'm not sure.
Yeah, a lot of stuff down deep is pink. You're right. Mm-hmm. You're dead right. And man, they've all got big eyes. Mm-hmm. Is that for light gathering, or as you say, is it that they see things in another spectrum that we can't explain? Like we can theorize all we like, but they see. We know that.
Oh, yeah.
It's just how. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So let me talk a little bit about the setup of the jigs themselves. I've got a kind of an example here just to show you, but for the people that are listening, you're going to use assist hooks on these jigs. There's, when you speed jig, generally speaking, you're going to have one larger assist hook on the top. That's generally how that goes. Sometimes people have two assist hooks on the top, but for slow pitch jigging, you generally fish two smaller assist hooks on the top and on the bottom. Okay?
I've noticed this. So, there's hooks hanging off them everywhere.
Right. We got this whole chandelier of hooks, that's kind of out there. So if you see how these hooks are set up, you'll notice a couple of things. The first thing is that these hooks are small, right? These are 3.0 Gamakatsu 510 hooks, okay? So a 3.0 hook is not a big hook particularly. But the reason why you use these smaller hooks is a couple reasons. The first reason is you want to have the least influence on the jig as possible, right? So the lighter the hooks, the better the jig is going to flow in the water, okay? So it's not going to have massive weight on one side. It's going to ruin the action of the jig. Second thing, smaller hooks, thinner gauge wire, better penetration in the fish's mouth. These rods, because they're so noodly, they're not hook setting machines. But if you have a hypodermic needle, goes way easier into skin than if you had a 2x4 trying to go into something, right? Yep. So it's the same kind of principle. Thinner hook, smaller pressure point goes into the fish's mouth easier. So last reason why you're going to use 4 of them though is because you want to equally distribute that pressure amongst the hooks. So not any one hook is taking the brunt of it. So what'll happen usually, the jig swims to the head of the jig, we'll call it, and the fish usually will attack from the front. And by the front, I mean whatever motion it's swimming in. So let's say it's going towards the head, it gets those hooks in its mouth. It realizes it has a hook, it goes to shake, the other hooks flip around and get it on the side. Now you've got the fish pocketbooked, and you've got all 4 hooks buried into this fish. Okay. Same thing. The fish, the jig flutters backwards, backslides. The fish thinks, oh, that's the front of it. It goes, gets those hooks. Then the other hooks swing around into its face, and it gets them.
So with that kind of like, the potential of 4 points in, you're probably not having a lot fall off on the way up.
Not too many. But the crazy thing is sometimes you will get hits, and believe me, you'll take these things out of your bag and get stuck a million times with these hooks, and not even realize how a fish can possibly get off of this. But for the most part, once you have that hook set, you're in there pretty good. You're going to be able to get the fish up, barring obviously you're going to lose fish, that happens, but for the most part, it's pretty routine that you'll get them up.
Yeah, once they're pinned usually. Mm-hmm. How are you tying all that back in? Like you mentioned before, an FG or a PR knot. What's your leader to jig system?
All right, so a leader to jig system. Let's start with the braid. So off of the braid, I personally run a PR knot. I find that PR knots are better when you're jigging. FG knots are usually better when you're casting. Just something smaller to go through the guides. Yep. A well-tied PR knot is going to retain almost 100%, if not 100%. Of your breaking strength of your line. So that's super important. Also passes through your guides really easily. I personally use a 50-pound fluorocarbon leader. I use the AFCO Psycho Pro fluorocarbon. 50 pound. I've had really good experiences with that. Land a lot of big fish on it. I usually use the very scientific 4 arm lengths of leader.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I'm familiar.
Yeah, the main reason for that isn't because it's a magic number. It allows me to have enough of a shock leader on it where I can retie several times, because tying that PR knot is not the quickest thing in the world, even though I believe it's the best possible line-to-line connection. So it allows you to cut off and retie if you need to multiple times. So in terms of the terminal connection itself, there's 2 different ways that you can tie your fluorocarbon to your jig. All right. The first is tying to a solid ring. Okay. You can tie straight onto a solid ring, or you can tie onto a ball bearing swivel. Right. I personally prefer the ball bearing swivel. Why do I prefer that? I prefer it because usually when a fish is coming up and it's a larger fish and its mouth is open and it's spinning in the water, that ball bearing swivel allows that fish to turn very freely as it's coming up, and reduces the amount of twist that's on your line as it comes up. Either way works.
I'm familiar with that, man. When you've got old bucket mouth coming up, and they always appear to be a much bigger fish than they are, and it's just doing circles the whole way up, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. And they come up, with their mouths open and they're spinning around. And I find personally that the ball bearing swivel works better for me. Use whatever works for you, and that's part of the fun of this, is figuring out what works for you. Now, the connection from that either that solid ring or the swivel, you're going to have tie your favorite knot on there. Personally, I use a Palomar knot. It's easy. I can tie it in my sleep. It retains its strength. I have good success with it. It's the knot that I use, but use whatever knot you're comfortable with. Off of that solid ring or ball bearing swivel, you're going to have your connection to your jig. So what you're going to connect it with is actually a split ring. So the split ring sits in between. So I'm showing you here on the video, but you see that split ring that I have right there? You're going to have your ball bearing swivel come directly to that split ring. Yeah. Off of that split ring is your solid ring to your hooks, and then the split ring connects to the top of your jig. All right. The importance for that is I can quickly change my jigs out whenever I want, and when I use the split ring pliers. A lot of people will ask, like, should I tie directly to the jig? No, because you're going to have to retie, cut off, all that stuff. I use a pair of split ring pliers, and basically within, you're seeing here, so let's see, 1, 2, 3 seconds, I'm off of my jig, and I can swap this one out, put another one on. Okay. So that's usually what I use. I use triple rack split rings, but any ones that you're comfortable with are good.
The beauty of a system like that, there's a number of variants of that, is if you're going to do a long run, it's so easy to rip your jig off, put it in your tackle bag, attach your assist hooks to whatever you want to, to your reel stem, or you might have a specialist hook keeper, or some people use their guides. I don't think that's a great idea personally, but you can then do a long run in the boat and not have a jig swinging around and damaging your gear.
What a fantastic point, because you see so many people ask, where should I store my jig? Or you've got people with this little tiny rod, and they've got a 300 gram jig hanging off the bottom guide, and they're like, I don't know why the rod broke. So by being able to do that, anytime I make a move on the boat, I'm always taking the jig off. It takes 3 seconds. Just do that. It's a much safer thing. It works out better for your tackle, and it allows you to switch out your jigs routinely. I mean, you'll see when I first start fishing, I'll switch out jigs like a crazy person for the first 20, 30 minutes that I'm fishing, until I get where I'm keyed in, what I think the fish are keyed in on versus where the conditions are for that day.
Yeah, so you're really sussing out your current, your drift lines, and getting the right combination of jig weight and jig action for the day, aren't you?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the most imperative thing. And I think really of all the things with slow pitch jigging, I think that is what separates a very good jig fisherman from just your average guy who's going to drop down a jig. Fishing's a lot like poker, right? There's a reason why the same 5 guys are at the final table in that tournament. Yeah. But every once in a while, the person who's never played poker before in their life is going to win the jackpot. Same thing with fishing, right? So by being keyed into that, knowing exactly how every jig in your bag performs, and that jig selection is really going to make you a better angler.
Now, here's a curveball for you. A guy we both know, Eric Glauber, who's an Australian slow pitch jigger, chatting with him the other day, and he said to ask you, why does SPJ outfish bait head-to-head all the time?
All right. Well, first, shout out to Eric Lob for the comment. Second of all, I don't know if it's necessarily true that it outfishes all the time. Okay, it's still fishing, and there's still going to be days where, for whatever reason, the fish want a dead piece of bait on the bottom or a live bait. But what I think is really important with slow pitch jigging is you're really the master of it, right? You're able to impart the action on a jig to create that wounded, easy meal for a fish. And on aggregate, a fish is going to take that easy meal versus something that they're going to have to work for, right? The second part of it is that this is an instinctual thing for them, right? They're seeing an easy meal that's a wounded piece of prey, and all of these fish, they're not vegetarians, right? They're going to eat whatever is there with their face. And by having this presentation of a wounded fish in the water, they instinctually go for it. It's like if you walk a dog down the street and the dog sees a squirrel running on the other side of the street. It's your family dog. It doesn't want to, it's not a killer, but that little thing, that animal, reptilian brain in there kicks in and goes, I want to eat that. Same thing with the jig. All right, so it creates that reaction strike is what people call it. And a lot of times it is more effective.
I do like that distinction you said earlier on about mechanical jigging or speed jigging. It's triggering the pursuit of the fish, of that fleeing bait fish, whereas SPJ is on the sick bait, the easy pickings. It's quite a good way to look at it, I think.
Yeah, I think so as well. And different fish, anyone who's fished for a while will know that certain fish are kind of keyed into different things. Your fish in your jack family, they just love to follow things. They'll chase just for sport, right? So they like a faster presentation a lot of times, and you can create that faster presentation with a slow pitch setup. There's really no limit to how you can present your jig in the water, and having the slow pitch setup actually gives you more versatility, in my opinion, to have a faster presentation, have a slower presentation, and really key that in for the fish.
Very, very species dependent there, isn't it, really?
It is.
I've got a noob question that's bothered me about SPJ for a long time. So it's a slow technique. For the most part, you're targeting a demersal. Why is there the retrieve action, the slow pumping, an element of winding to bring it up through the water column and then dropping it back down? Given that you're targeting bottom fish, and given the type of technique that it is, that it's pulled up, it kicks, and then it flutters down, why aren't you just simply bobbing up and down with no retrieve at all?
Okay, so good question. When I originally started talking about the rods, and I talked about those long fall rods, those are much more of a lift and fall. That simpler technique. Lift up, let the jig fall. Lift up, let the jig fall.
Okay.
The fact of the matter is, though, a lot of times the fish may be staggered, right? You may have, groupers on the bottom, snappers a little bit higher than them, and then maybe something that's even higher than them in the water column. So by being able to kind of know exactly where that jig is, measuring those handle turns, you can target different areas of the water. Okay, so for instance, let's say I go to my sounder says, all right, you're marking fish 6 meters off the bottom. Well, I know if I retrieve, my 1 meter per crank, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 off the bottom, I'm pretty much right in front of their face at that point.
Yep.
Right. So
yep.
That's I think where maybe the distinction would be is rather than just have that simple lift and fall off the bottom, which is certainly productive, you can target things a little bit better by being more precise.
I personally feel that slowly moving up through the water column has got a more natural presentation about it. But it's always like just gone through my head. Why don't we just bob up and down? But yeah, there you go. I'm really keen to give some of this a go this spring for us, which is your fall. We've got a bay. It's 9 kilometres from my door here, Port Phillip Bay, which has an amazing run of our pink snapper. And I know that pink snapper go really well on SPJ techniques elsewhere, but no one does it here, man. No one does it, and I'm really keen to give it a go. They can be a bit of a brown cow species that just wander around the bay in schools and don't hold on structure a lot of the time. Our bay doesn't have a lot of reef. So it's one of the techniques that would probably be setting up drifts and moving with the fish, but I'm really keen to give it a go.
Yeah, I think it's the best part about this is trying it out for yourself and seeing what works in your particular area, and modifying accordingly. One of the things and the reasons why I got into this type of fishing was I just got tired of bait fishing, presenting a bait. All right, I know how to bottom fish from a drifting boat, from an anchored boat. I know how to kite fish, I know how to troll. You do all those things and you kind of run out of, I don't want to say fun, but it kind of gets monotonous a little bit. And by bringing in this new technique and being able to learn and actually dive into the technique, especially in your area with the pink snapper that you have in the bay, you can learn different techniques. And the best part is you'll start to realize the fish are in areas that you didn't know they were. Right. So, for instance, for us, we have blackfin tuna, which is the smallest of the tuna species, but they're pretty plentiful here. And most people thought you could only catch those fish on the troll. You're going to catch them, trolling feathers around, and you're going to be in certain water depths. What we found, I can't tell you how many of those I've caught on the bottom in, 200 meters of water.
Right.
They've gone all the way down there. Or I've caught a sailfish, that thumped me, 90 meters down. But you mostly would fish those with kites. So, but with your snapper in a new area, maybe you'll find that maybe they are holding someplace, or they're hitting things a little bit differently, or alternatively, maybe this is a better technique to do it. And figure out.
Yeah, keen to give it a go, man. I'm really excited. All right, Benny, you have been so kind with your time. It's been quite a clinic, and I am really keen to give these techniques a go this year. As I said, I'm sure a lot of our listeners have got a heap out of this. Where can they find you and follow you on the socials?
Sure. Well, thank you, first of all, for having me on here. It's been my pleasure. Happy to always talk about fishing and introduce people to a new technique. On social media, Facebook, Benny Ortiz, just my personal page. If you look on Instagram, Mr. Benny Ortiz, MrBennyOrtiz. Follow along with the adventures there. Thanks to my sponsors, Temple Reef Rods, Accurate Reels, and AFCO Clothing, which have all been great to me over the years. And thank you for this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Benny, thank you so much for your time, man, and we will chat again. I'll let you know how I go this spring.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to The Outflow by Ebbtide Tackle. Subscribe to the podcast to listen to other episodes and stay up to date with new releases. And don't forget to rate and review.